clues that we have about what's causing pain is the location of the pain. When the pain becomes more intense and you can't tell us where it's really coming from, then we are collectively together in a bad bind, because it starts requiring a little bit of imagination on our parts and some really greater efforts to identify what's really causing the pain and where that pain's coming from. Much like the woman who got sent to us by the neurologist saying, we think she needs a psych consult.
They said she needs a shrink.
In fact, what she needed was someone who understood that, in fact, she can be feeling pain from this little nerve in her toe over all the foot, much of the leg, and in fact the other foot as well. And that you need to not get distracted by the fact that she's also constipated because she's on methadone. It's not that she's got irritable bowel. You need to be not distracted by the fact that she has ringing in the ears because she's overtaking the ibuprofen because her pain's so bad. And that will cause ringing in your ears. And you need to not be distracted by the fact that she can't sleep because she's on the duloxetine, which prevents her from sleeping.
And anti-seizure.
Right? You need to ignore some of those things. And you need to even ignore the fact that her eye is twitching and we can't explain why that is. And you need to just listen to what she's telling you about, look, I've been a healthy person my whole life. And I had this event happen at this particular spot on my foot, and now I have pain all over my foot and my leg and on my other foot too, right?
He's very smart.
And this is a picture of, you've seen these fancy MRIs of people's brains when they're feeling different
Renaissance
things.
imaging shows
This
you
is a
details
fancy
of your
MRI
brain.
of the cervical spinal cord, the spinal cord in your neck. When somebody puts a heat probe on your hand and starts to heat it up. And what you see is at 46 degrees, when you start heating the hand and it starts feeling painful, you start seeing more blood flow in this part of the cord. And as you go up a little higher, a little hotter, you start feeling it, you see some activity there. But if we really start making it painful and we go up to 48 degrees, it lights up a big part of the cord, and not just on one side of the cord. Even though the probe's just on one side, it actually is lighting up both sides of the cord. And in fact, if you do these same kind of fancy MRIs and you look at the brain, what you see when somebody puts a probe on your left hand is not that the right side of the brain lights up. This is what we're all taught in med school and in biology, that in fact your fibers cross and connect to the other side of the brain. When somebody puts a painful thing on your hand and they look at you with that MRI, the brain lights up symmetrically on both sides. You can't tell from looking at the MRI what side the pain is on. The miracle is that you don't feel it most of the time on both sides. Because in fact, it's lighting up both sides. You know, those maps that you have in your brain that tells you where it's coming from, getting lit up on both sides. And yet somehow your conscious experience of it normally is that it's coming from one side. But this woman with her injured toe that's getting the abnormal signal, she's overwhelmed that normal processing, so now she's feeling it on both sides. But you turn off the little firing nerve on the toe that was injured, and the pain goes away on both sides. And not only does it go away on both sides, but her perception of numbness that replaces the pain she feels on both sides. Right? She's now mapping that nerve signal to both sides. So what do we do for her? Well, the first thing we do is we optimize her medications. One of the medications she was on is in fact a reasonably effective medication for many forms of nerve pain, and that's duloxetine. Duloxetine is a drug that is was developed initially as an antidepressant, and it works by preventing nerve cells from taking up norepinephrine and serotonin. So it turns out that some nerve cells release a neurotransmitter called norepinephrine, and some different nerve cells release a neurotransmitter called serotonin, and it turns out that those nerve cells that do that, among others, are these descending nerve cells. What they release here in the spinal cord to turn off this signal is serotonin and norepinephrine, okay? And so if you give someone a drug that prevents the serotonin and norepinephrine from getting sucked out of the synapse, that increases the amount of norepinephrine and serotonin that's here to signal to tell these nerves to not talk to each other. And so if you give duloxetine, the thought is that it's enhancing the signaling here by preventing the norepinephrine and serotonin that are released from being taken up, and it can therefore help for some people for nerve pain. And it turns out that that's true. And in fact, some of the data that shows that is here. These are people who have, this is data from people who have diabetic nerve pain in their feet, okay? And this is data that they presented to the FDA so that the FDA would allow them to go out and market to doctors, saying, we have a drug that actually works for nerve pain in the feet. So they looked at people with diabetic nerve pain, and what we have here on the y-axis is the average change in their 24-hour pain score, where they're asked on a 0 to 10 scale, if 0 is no pain and 10 is terrible pain, what number would you give your pain? And so this is how much they've changed since baseline. So at day 0, so this is on the x-axis, we have week 0 to week 12. At the beginning, clearly they have no change from baseline. But when they're given duloxetine, which is this line and these two lines, they start to do better than if they're given placebo. Okay, placebo is the big dark line on top.
It's nothing.
But in terms of average change, what you see is that duloxetine does better than placebo. And it does better than placebo starting right away, but it keeps getting better and better and better than placebo.
Placebo
over
means
6
no
or 7
nothing.
or even 8 weeks. Okay? And we don't really understand why that is, because to the extent that we know that this drug causes an inhibition of the reuptake of serotonin and norepinephrine, that's like fully done in the first 24 hours. So we don't have any idea really why this drug continues to work better and better over weeks, but it does. And the other thing that you see is that if you enroll diabetics with nerve pain into a study, if you do nothing at all for them, but pay attention to them and listen to them, and give them a placebo, in fact, they do better, markedly better over time. And some of that may be due to the quote-unquote placebo effect, which is the expectancy of getting some benefit. And some of that may be the fact that people who have diabetic nerve pain don't go to their doctor every day randomly. They go to their doctor when their pain happens to be worse, right? So if they have an average amount of pain, maybe they deal with that most of the time, but for whatever reason the pain gets bad. Maybe they get a little infection on their foot, or maybe somebody hits their foot, or somebody steps on them, and their pain is worse, so they go to the doctor. They go to the doctor when their pain is worse than average, and the doctor takes them at that point and enrolls them in the study, right? And so even if the doctor does nothing, because their pain is worse than average, if you simply wait, their pain will probably go back to the way it is on average. And so we call that regression to the mean, so some of that's going on here. But the main thing to understand is this is how much better you do than placebo if you get 20 milligrams a day of duloxetine. And this is how much better you do with placebo if you get 60 milligrams. And this is how much better you do if you get 120 milligrams, okay? And when DS came to see me, she was only on 30 milligrams. And these little asterisks here are there to show you that this is statistically significantly better than placebo, but you can see 20 milligrams was not. And what's nice about this is, if you look over time, what you see is there is a dose response, right? If you go from 20 to 60 to 120 milligrams, people tend to do better and better with regard to their pain. So if we want to optimize her meds, she's already on duloxetine and she's only on 30 milligrams, you might say, well, we should ramp her up to 60 or 120 milligrams. We should give her more until one of two things happens. Either she says my pain is better, or she starts telling me about some side effect that's going to prevent me from going up on the dose more, right? Some dose-limiting side effect. Now the problem with that is sometimes your first dose-limiting side effect is something dangerous, right? In which case you don't want to keep going up on the dose until you hit something dangerous. The other problem with that is that it turns out that the company that makes this stuff, duloxetine, charges a lot of money for it. And so your insurance company does not want to pay for it, okay? And even though they're looking at the same data that you're looking at that shows that at every single time point, 120 milligrams is better than 60 milligrams, the study here is powered to look at a difference this big and say it's statistically significant. They didn't put enough people in the study so that they could say a difference this big was statistically significant, okay? They just wanted to prove that any dose was better than placebo. They're not interested in proving that 120 milligrams is better than 60 milligrams. In fact, they're disincentivized to do that. Why? If they wanted to have the power to say that this difference was statistically significant, they probably need like 3 times as many patients. Okay, so instead of having 400 people in their study, they'd have to have 1,200 people in their study. And what that would mean is that they would have an increased ability to find rare but serious problems, right? You don't want to find rare but serious problems with your billion-dollar drug. This is what happened to the makers of Vioxx. They started off marketing this drug with relatively small trials looking at it for pain, and they found that it worked for pain. And then some clever people said, well, you know, the same enzyme that's involved in pain that Vioxx works for also seems to be involved in colon cancer. And so maybe if we give people Vioxx, we can prevent colon cancer. But colon cancer, it turns out, takes a long time to develop, and it doesn't develop in everybody. So if you want to prove a drug works to prevent colon cancer, you've got to give that drug to a lot of people. And it turns out when you give that drug to a lot of people, now you have the ability to find rare but serious side effects, like heart attacks, which is what they found. And then they don't even get to give that drug to the people with the pain anymore, right? So they lost their billion-dollar drug. So what you can see here is the drug company has a very strong incentive to show that one dose is better than placebo, and then to not study anymore, okay? And so the drug company is never going to go back and study the difference between 60 and 120 milligrams to prove that 120 milligrams is actually better than 60, okay? And so your insurance company says, well, nobody proved that 120 milligrams works better than 60 milligrams.
We won't pay for
Even
it.
though all the available data suggests that it's more likely true than not that 120 works better than 60, and even though you as an individual might say, when I took 120, my pain was better than when I just took 60, the insurance company says, wait a second here, nobody proved that. And the drug company wants to charge us twice as much for 120 milligrams. So we're not going to cover that. Your plan doesn't cover that because that wasn't proven to be helpful. Even though you can look at the data right there and see very clearly that a lot of people respond to 120 better than 60. But there it is. That's medicine in America today. So, the advantages of duloxetine, even though you can't keep going up to the dose you want, the advantages are that it really doesn't make you stupid.
Painkiller.
A lot of the drugs we have for nerve pain can make you forgetful, forget where you parked the car, forget the name of the person who you met yesterday. So duloxetine tends to not make you stupid. The other name for duloxetine, by the way, Cymbalta. It also does have an antidepressant effect for many people. And since pain and depression are often come together because pain can make you depressed, and it turns out that if you're depressed, you're at higher likelihood of developing a new chronic pain problem. And so a lot of people who have nerve pain also have some element of depression, and duloxetine will also help that, which is nice. And the last thing is that it's weight neutral. Duloxetine doesn't tend to cause you to gain weight or to lose weight. In the 52-week studies that they did of these people with nerve pain, they gained on average 1 pound. It turns out a lot of people gain 1 pound over the year. Side effects of duloxetine, if you start people at a dose that works, if you start people at a dose that works, 25% of them will get nauseated, okay? And this is one of the things you're going to hear over and over about these drugs that work for nerve pain. You must, if you want to be successful, start at a dose that does not work. I, as a doctor, have to give you a dose that I know does not work. I have to convince you that you should take this drug even though it is not helping you. And that you should persist in taking that drug even though you feel no benefit from it. Because someday I'm going to increase the dose to a dose that might help you. All right? So the side effects are not just a function of the amount of drug, but of your history and the time we have given you to accommodate to the drug. All right? So you might think, I vomit when I get duloxetine, but that's not true. You vomited when you were given duloxetine under the circumstances in which you were given it. The side effects are not a property of the drug, they're a property of how much your doctor gave you, how fast. Okay?
Wow.
Other things to worry about with duloxetine, you shouldn't take duloxetine if you're on some other kind of antidepressant like an SSRI, because now you can have too much serotonin floating around and you can get a kind of problem called serotonin syndrome. You're not doctors, you don't need to know what serotonin syndrome is. The thing that you do need to know is, like some of these other drugs, you don't want to stop duloxetine all of a sudden if you've been on it for a long time, because you will feel like you are going crazy. You will be tearful, you will be crying, you will feel like you're exiting your body, and you have little lightning zaps all over your body, and you will wonder what is going on. And I know that this is the case because one of my patients knocked yes. Another one of my patients who was getting duloxetine and getting some benefit from it, not a ton, was also having some sexual side effects. And she didn't want to talk to me about her sexual side effects, so she just went ahead and stopped taking it. And I got a call from her husband a couple of days later saying, Ellen's crying and she's, saying that she's exiting her body, and
she's exiting her body.
And it turned out she had stopped the duloxetine. We put her back on the duloxetine, and she was fine. And then we tapered her off over a couple of weeks. No big deal. There are pharmacokinetic concerns with duloxetine. What does that mean? That's a fancy way of saying that when I give you a 60 milligram pill, the amount that's in your blood is very different than the amount that's in your blood, because it turns out that duloxetine is metabolized by a particular enzyme in your liver, and different people have very different functions of that enzyme. And so even though I give you both 60 milligrams, and we're trained as lay people from the time that we're 4 years old to think that there is a right dose, right? Because you know that the doctor who gives you the amoxicillin when you have your ear infection when you're a kid, writes down the right dose, and that is the dose that is right. But in fact, for medication like duloxetine, when I give it to you, the amount that's in your blood is very, very different depending on not just how much we put in your mouth, but how fast your liver chews it up. And it turns out that the enzyme in your liver that chews up this drug varies by a factor of 60, meaning in one person it's going 60-fold faster than in another person. So the difference in your blood level can be off by as much as a factor of 60. So your level might be 6, and someone else's level might be 360. All right? And there's no commercially available blood test to tell you, and if you happen to be one of the fast metabolizers, I can't give you more to get your blood level up, because A, I can't do a test to see that it's low in the first place, and B, your insurance company doesn't care. They're only covering it up to 60, period. If you happen to be a fast metabolizer, tough luck. All right. So I took her off the duloxetine for some of these reasons that I've told you about, because I can't see does she have enough in her blood. And in fact, I wanted to give her a different drug called dizipramine. And I can't give dizipramine to someone who's on duloxetine because they have some overlapping mechanisms.
I don't care.
Dizipramine, it turns out, is in a family of medications called tricyclic antidepressants. nobody really uses tricyclic antidepressants for depression anymore. But it turns out that when they were using them for depression, what they discovered was that a bunch of people who had diabetic nerve pain started coming back and saying, hey doc, I'm still depressed, but my feet don't hurt anymore. And they discovered that in fact it works for nerve pain, and it has nothing to do with the antidepressant response, because you can give it to people who aren't depressed and they in fact get better with their nerve pain, and you can give it to people who are depressed and they stay depressed but their nerve pain goes away. So there is a complete divorce between the antidepressant effect and the pain effect. And it turns out that dizipramine and these tricyclic antidepressants are the most effective drugs for nerve pain. They are more effective than the duloxetine or the Topamax that she came in on, but people don't tend to prescribe them very much. And the reason is well, there's a number of reasons. The most important reason is they're off patent, which means that you can get some of these tricyclic antidepressants for $4 a month at Walmart and Target, and the drug companies are not marketing them. And as you know, while the drug companies do in fact market things like duloxetine, the NIH or Medicare doesn't pay people like me to go to doctors' offices and say, hey, let me tell you about the advantages of this off-patent drug. All right? Even though Medicare really should, they should do that, because they would save a lot of money, because then doctors would be writing for dizipramine instead of duloxetine. But it turns out that we have a way of comparing the relative efficacy of these different drugs, and one way to compare the relative efficacy of these different drugs is to see what is the quote-unquote number needed to treat for the different drugs. The number needed to treat for these drugs is how many people do you have to compare to in order for one person to have a 50% reduction.